Today's liturgy on this most holy night is certainly focused on the marvelous events that Jesus did. But I would ask you to put yourselves in the feet of the apostles. We know from the Gospels that about 2 weeks earlier than this mystical supper, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a mountain. And there, Peter, James, and John had a vision, an experience, and they saw Elijah. Elijah was at that time thought to be the most important prophet because God talked to him in a tiny whisper on a mountain. And they saw Moses. Moses, of course, gave them the greatest gift, the gift of God's law. No one in the world knew, but the Israelites knew what God wanted. They knew his law in the book of the Torah. And so those were the two most important people for those apostles. And they saw Jesus in the middle of Moses and Elijah, and he had a dazzling white cloak. They didn't understand that. What is their local rabbi, this preacher from a nowhere town of Galilee, standing between Moses and Elijah? And they must have thought about this. God is doing something new, and our local teacher is at the center of this. Then it says, when he came down from the mountain, he went up to Jerusalem, and he told them, the Messiah must suffer, die, and rise again. The next thing we know, he appears in Jerusalem, and it said he cleansed the temple, the merchants and the money changers. And they, it says, the leaders of the people went up to him and said, on what authority do you do these things? They had, they wanted to know what right is he to cleanse the temple. And Jesus said, I will destroy this temple made by hand, and I will raise a temple not made by hand up. Well, the temple was the most important thing for the Israelites. That was the center of their world. That was where the presence of God was. And he said he would destroy this temple. That was the last straw. Jesus crossed the line. The leaders from then on, you can see in the Gospel, say he has to go. He threatened to destroy. He said that it took 46 years to build this temple. And this local teacher said, was talking about the destruction of the temple. The next thing we know, he wants to have the Passover with his disciples. And can you imagine the tension at that meal? The apostles saw him with Moses and Elijah. This is the center of God's plan. He threatened to destroy the temple. And now he's going to be at the Passover meal. The disciples must, of course, were very tense. They were probably terrified. And during that meal, he took the bread of affliction as part of the Passover meal, the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the desert, and he said, this is my body, which will be given up for you. And then he took the third cup of blessing, and he said, this is the chalice of my blood. You know what the apostles thought? He's using words of temple sacrifice. He's not using the words of the Passover. He's using words of temple sacrifice. You may know something about Jewish temple sacrifice. It was the most sacred part of Jerusalem. And in the whole temple, there was a courtyard, and there was the holy place. There was a big curtain, 15 feet tall, and it covered the Holy of Holies. And this was the presence of God, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. This was the most important. It gave meaning, purpose, and unity to the people at that time. And there are two important aspects of the sacrifice they offered. Only one person could enter into that Holy of Holies, and that was the high priest, and only once a year. But before he could enter, there had to be a sacrifice of a wolf. Animal sacrifice was very important to the Jews, and also to the people of other Semitic groups, because animal blood is innocent blood. Animals act and do what animals are made to act and do. Human blood is not innocent blood. And so the Israelites and other Semitic groups would sacrifice an animal take the blood. And for the high priest, he would have to go into the Holy of Holies with incense, probably to cover up his own sinfulness. He represented the people. And with this cup of blood, this innocent blood, and sprinkle the blood on the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because sinfulness and holiness cannot coexist. He had to prepare himself to enter into the holiness of God by that sacrifice, and by that smoke he could enter into the Holy of Holies. And he was the only one. The Jewish people could not enter into the full presence of God. Only the high priest, only once a year, and only with those sacrifices. Jesus is talking about that. He's saying, I'm going to give up my body, not the body of an animal. I give up my body, will be given up for you, and my blood will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. This is innocent blood. And the blood of animals was innocent, and it shielded holiness from sinfulness. Can you imagine what the apostles were thinking at that time? They were very tense, they were frightened, and now they're very confused. Jesus was preparing them for what's coming up. He was to suffer and die on the cross. They wouldn't understand that. And then they would find his tomb empty, and a message that he's been raised up. Jesus prepared them at this mystical supper for that new reality. Jesus was the center of God's new plan, and he was preparing his disciples. What did he do after those momentous events which they didn't understand, which terrified them more? He took off his robe, took a basin of water, and washed their feet. Why did he do that? Because that's the beginning of hospitality. That's the beginning of love. If you invite someone to your house from those dusty, unpaved roads, the first thing you can do is help them clean their feet. And this is the beginning of love. We think of the needs of our neighbors, think of those next to us, and serve their needs. Isn't that interesting? After this momentous supper, Jesus said, do this. Do what I do. This is an example for you. Learn more about love, because God now, God's presence wants to come not to just the high priest. The temple curtain will be torn in half. In the tomb, that 15-foot curtain is protecting the Holy of Holies. The book of Hebrews tells us that when Christ's side was pierced, so the temple was pierced. God's holiness was not reserved for one holy priest once a year. God's presence was to be for all people who are washed by the blood of the Lamb, as it says in the book of Revelation. All people who are baptized and in Christ are washed by the blood of the Lamb, innocent blood, Jesus' blood. And the presence of God is offered to us. And those people are us. People like you and me are offered now the presence of God through the church, through the sacrament Jesus left. And we have to continue and see the resurrection, because God created a new time and space at the resurrection. Jesus was no longer limited to the things of this earth. He can be here in Coriopolis and give us the true presence of God. And so this is a momentous night. Let us learn the lesson Jesus asked us. Let us learn to love one another more, so we can receive God's presence, who is love, more and more. And let us follow his example and appreciate this most bounteous gifts